Hello and welcome to Take Me Home, the podcast offering a social democratic alternative for the politically homeless. I'm Hilary Salt.
And I'm Sebastian Moore.
And we're sharing a mic today because we, for the first time in this setup, have an honoured guest with us. So our guest is Dr Ken McLaughlin, previous social worker in mental health and a senior lecturer in social work and mental health. Welcome to the podcast, Ken.
Thank you for inviting me.
We're really looking forward to discussing quite a lot of mental health kind of issues with you, particularly where the kind of crossover is with politics. Mm-hmm. But first of all, we should perhaps just say we know that you've written one of the really good letters on liberty for the Battle of Ideas, Academy of Ideas, a series of booklets. Do you want to say a little bit about that?
Well, it's not for me to judge the quality of it. That's for other people to judge. But yes, I was asked to write a letter on liberty for the Battle of Ideas, which I thought, in a sense, was rather strange because I worked as an approved mental health professional and I deprived many people of their liberty. But I decided to write it because I thought you can justify those decisions in ways that sort of guarantee political freedom and liberty and subjectivity. And I was interested as well in the historical... I've always been interested in the way society and psychiatry have influenced each other. And if you've read the letter on liberty, I give some of the more historical and extreme examples. Probably the worst. In 1851, Samuel Cartwright, who was a physician in the southern states of the USA, came up with a mental disorder called drapetomania. Now, drapetomania was a mental disorder that only affected a certain group of people, and that was black slaves. But it only affected a small percentage of those, or maybe a large percentage, I don't know, those who tried to run away from slavery. So at the time, slavery was justified by many. It was a natural state. So people who were fleeing, they couldn't want freedom. They had to be mentally ill. Now, it was widely mocked at the time. People were thinking, come on, Samuel, this is nonsense. But other people did take it on board. And I think that's a very blatant and horrendous example of psychiatry and society coalescing to let societal norms of the time be justifiable. And you can, there's many other historical examples. The former USSR political dissidents were often labelled mentally ill because they disagreed with the Soviet regime. If you're arguing against what was presented as a rational, scientific way of organising society, well, you must be irrational. And I think I used the quote in the letter on liberty where one dissident was told by the psychiatrist, your disease is dissent. Mm-hmm. Fast forward to the 70s, 1973, before... homosexuality was declassified as a mental disorder by the American Psychiatric Association. Now, that had nothing to do with advances in psychiatry. That was due to changing social and cultural mores at the time. So I've always been interested in that. And part of my argument, I suppose, in the letter on liberty, but also in a lot of things that I've written, that it's no different today. The examples may not be so blatant, but the way we discuss psychiatry, mental health, social policy, mental health law is influenced by the social, cultural and political dynamics of the day.
I suppose the thing that people will immediately leap to thinking about in the current context is that Valdo Caldequine case, where it kind of... the feeling, I think, the public feeling is that the public were let down by perhaps people being worried that it would be kind of racist to section that person. Is that something? Is that a right interpretation that the public have?
And just elaborate on what that case was as well.
Falco Callicane, he was a long-term mental health patient diagnosed with schizophrenia, and he'd been sectioned a few times, many of them for violent incidents. I think one, he was trying to get into a woman's flat and she had to jump out the window for her own safety. But he'd been arrested a few times. And the final time, he killed 2 students in Nottingham, stabbed them to death. And later the same day, he stabbed a school caretaker to death as well. Obviously then arrested, and he's detained under the Mental Health Act. He'll probably never see daylight again. Well, never see freedom again in that sense. Now, the inquiry is still ongoing into what went wrong, but I think it is, from what I've looked at, there were several sort of failings. He had a history of violence. He was clearly mentally disordered. He'd stopped taking his medication. He was disengaging. Now, the race thing is, the way it's been presented in the media is slightly disingenuous. Now, it is the case, from what I've read of reports of the inquiry, that there was a time when they were assessing him under the Mental Health Act, and apparently one of the professionals says, no, we shouldn't, because we're detaining too many black people. They're overrepresented, and that was one of the factors in the decision not to section him. However, that was some time before the attack. He had been sectioned, I think, at least 4 times since that initial decision not to section him was taken.
Okay.
So it didn't. It's obviously been a factor, and I suppose it illustrates that it may be a factor in other professionals' decision, but it wasn't a factor in what led to him committing those homicides.
Okay.
The race issue in psychiatry is an interesting one. It's often presented as, well, the overrepresentation of Afro-Caribbean men generally is used to psychiatry being racist. Now, certainly if you look at the statistics, you could argue the statistics back that up. But it's not as simple as that. It's a lot more complex. So, for example, it tends to display the role of social factors in the onset of mental disorder. So many psychiatrists would say, you can't blame us. We come in at crisis point. The damage has been done.
Yeah.
Psychiatrists, generally speaking, if you've only got mild to moderate mental health problems, they're too busy to be bothered about you. They get involved when it's crisis point. Even in my own role as a approved mental health professional, it was crisis point, generally speaking, where I got involved. So there was other, so class is an issue. I'm sure discrimination is an issue. Poverty, employment. And one of the biggest factors is actually immigration status. And if you think about it, it makes quite a bit of sense. If you've fled or left your home country, often you arrive into a new culture. You've lost your social connections. They're back home. Probably not so bad now. You can Zoom your family and your friends, but back in the day you couldn't. So that's a factor. And also, if you think about people fleeing wars and persecutions, they may have witnessed or been subject to some horrendous things. So in that sense, it's fairly understandable that they will have some sort of trauma that they're dealing with as well. So it's a lot more complex than just saying, psychiatry is racist, that many anti-racists do, actually. Like I say, we can't dismiss it totally, because there's a statistic I mentioned in that letter on Liberty, where when people are being discharged from hospital on a community treatment order gives professionals some powers over ex-patients, I suppose, when they're discharged from hospital. And that study found that Afro-Caribbean men were 10 times more likely to be put on one than their white counterparts. Now, that's something that needs investigating, but the general principle that psychiatry is racist doesn't really stand up to scrutiny when you look at the complexity of the issue.
What was that community treatment order? So it's when they're discharged. Is there a higher risk, or is there a reason why someone would be put on that?
Well, when the Mental Health Act of 1983, apart from very, very few cases, when you were sectioned under the Mental Health Act, obviously you lose your liberty, you can be given medication against your will. You lose the rights that we take for granted as free political subjects, if you like. Prior to the changes, the revisions in 2007 to that Mental Health Act, if you were sectioned and then you were discharged, apart from a few extreme examples, you regained all the rights and freedoms that citizens had. That included the right not to take any medication. If your doctor tells you you need medication, you do not have to take it. Obviously, when you're sectioned, you do have to take it. But when you were taken off your section and discharged into the community, you regained all the rights that we take for granted. You don't have to agree with your doctor. You don't have to do what your doctor says. You don't have to take medication against your will. The 2007 Act changed that, and it brought in they're commonly called community treatment orders. The proper name is supervised community in the treatment, but we call them CTOs. That's psychiatric ASBO, as we've sometimes called them. And what that meant was that when you're discharged, you could be compelled not to take your medication. That was part of it initially, so the nurses could come in and inject you over the kitchen table, and that's too far. But what they can do, if you refuse your medication, they can take you back into hospital and assess you and give you medication if they deem it necessary. And also they could say you have to reside at a certain address. So my objection to CTOs at the time, and I had this with some senior psychiatrists who were in favour of it, was that in the letter of liberty, I think I make this point, you can justify removing somebody's liberty at the point when you're sectioning them, because they may not be political or moral subjects in the way that we understand the term. They'll be psychotic, they're not in touch with reality, etc., etc. But at the point of discharge, that's rarely the case. You could have full capacity. You could have no psychotic symptoms. So in the past, you returned as a free citizen. Now you return as a diminished hybrid of the two. You're neither a patient nor a subject. You're a community patient, and it bridges
that's
that
only for
gap.
people on these community treatment orders.
Yes,
I presume that's a really small percentage of people that are discharged. Isn't it?
Well, when they were first mooted, and there were obviously, these were mooted because there was a perception that care in the community had failed. There was high-profile tragedies where ex-patients had killed, some very serious ones. I think the most high-profile was a case of Jonathan Zito, who was killed by Christopher Clunas in Finsbury Park Tube Station, 1980s, I think. I can't remember the exact date. Stabbed him in the eye, totally unknown. They were strangers. But there was some others as well, and community care had failed, so they wanted to bring them in. And the idea was to make sure to stop what was called the revolving door patient. So you get psychotic, Sebastian, we section you, we give you your medication, you get better, you go out, you stop taking your medication, and the cycle starts again. And they originally estimated that in the first year, there'd probably be about 200 people needed to be put on one. These are your revolving door patients. That was in England and Wales. In the first 6 months, after professionals could use CTOs, in England alone, there was over 2,100 people put on them. Now, I don't think you have to be a natural cynic to think that people were being put on CTOs not for their benefit, but for the benefit of the professionals, just in case something goes wrong. You know, and the numbers have actually increased. It's a few years since I've looked, but over the years, the numbers increased year by year, and many people were put on them when they were discharged after their first admission to hospital, which wasn't the intention. It was the revolving door patient that was the initial target.
Ken, what you're identifying there is a kind of lack of boundary where these CTOs, patients, they, as you say, they're kind of hybrid. They're not a patient. They're not a kind of free person and free sovereign person. But that lack of boundary seems to me a really big issue in the mental health arena. So, you know, one of the things we see nowadays is lots and lots of people have mental health diagnoses for things that perhaps at one point we wouldn't have seen as mental illness. So, you know, if you look at that kind of range of what you might call mental illness, from, as you say, people with, you know, really serious problems to people who've maybe just feel a bit shy. That's quite problematic, isn't it? Not having any clear boundaries there.
It's a very interesting phenomenon. And again, I think, you know, it's related to a lot of social and sort of political changes over the years. In the 1960s and 1970s, what was loosely termed the anti-psychiatry movement, although it's a term I dislike. I like the term critical psychiatry, because the power that the psychiatric profession and approved social workers like myself had to detain people against their will. I don't know if you know it, but you're detained if, generally speaking, if two medics say you suffer from a mental disorder, and if you look at the wording, it says, "in my opinion," and then someone like me looks to see, well, have we got another alternative that we could use as opposed to sectioning them? If I think not, I sign my paper and into hospital you go. There's no jury of your peers. It's basically done on what the professionals think you may do, you know. But there was a coalition of people, generally Thomas Satz, R.B. Lang, Irving Goffman, possibly, the sociologist, loosely termed sort of anti-psychiatry movement. What was interesting about that, they were very anti-diagnosis. They were, a diagnosis was seen as a sort of unhelpful term for what were social and personal problems, and maybe psychological problems. Thomas Satz, probably one of the most famous, he argued that people don't have a mental disease, they have problems in living. So, but over the years, that criticism of diagnosis has morphed into a demand for a diagnosis. You see that, and people use it as a form of identity now. But what's also interesting about that is it's only specific diagnosis. Now, because when I worked at Manchester Met, I did all the mental health teaching, and occasionally I would have students come up to me to tell me they had had mental health problems. In 20 years, I had two people come up and tell me that they were diagnosed with schizophrenia. I had one who told me they had been diagnosed with clinical depression and had been sectioned. Nobody told me that they were a psychopath or that they suffered from antisocial personality disorder, but the people that would say are suffering from stress or depression, but the depression would be sometimes the general stresses of everyday life, the ups and downs of everyday life, which tending to be medicalised. And we are seeing, I think we're seeing that blurring of boundaries in a whole host of things today. So you see it in the universities, National Union of Students, portraying university used to be seen as somewhere that you go, it's exciting, you're learning, you're going to be intellectually challenged. These days it's portrayed more as somewhere where your life, or certainly your psychological health, is going to be seriously harmed. But the NUS and Student Minds, they're actually quite bad because they present these figures of 80%, 60%, that type of thing. But when you look at them closely, it'll be things like, tick this box, have you ever been worried about the future? Oh, who hasn't?
Yeah, there's something wrong with you if you've not.
Yeah, wait till they get to my age. You know what I mean? But there is that sort of conflation. And even I suppose, I'm not sure it's a brilliant example because it couldn't downplay even if you look at student suicide, there's a big campaigns against student suicide. Understandably, it's terribly tragic. But students are actually less likely to commit suicide than the same age cohort who don't go to university. So you could frame it as, come to university, you've less chance of killing yourself. It's a rather crude sort of example, but you can see the way it's been framed as being harmful to your health. Now, when I look at some of that, there's various things come in. There's I think the demise of class politics, the rise of work stress is an interesting phenomenon. David Wainwright and David Kalnin, they do a brilliant book, Work Stress, The Making of a Modern Epidemic. And they have chapters on various aspects of it. But one that really interests me was the changing role of trade unions. And they looked at the demise of class politics in the 80s, specifically with the defeat of the miners' strike and the steel workers and all of that. And how the unions had to change track, because the old way, everybody out, let's take to the streets, revolution tomorrow, that wasn't going to work. They'd been smashed. The working class as a political force was gone. And that's when you gradually seen the concept of work stress being highlighted by trade unions. So it went from emphasising collective action to emphasising individual inaction by going off sick with stress. So it's interesting and that also tied in with, I think, the rise of identity politics. It started, some of it was actually, I thought was quite good. There was, if you see the way, if we take it, if we stick to mental health. So, you had this sort of anti-racist campaigns, black campaigns, feminist campaigns, sexuality campaigns, etc., disability campaigns. And then you began to get the rise of the mental health movement as well, users' movements, who've done some very, very good work, survivor movements, that sort of thing. And one of them, I think it was a chap called Peter Campbell, he says, we started the movements because we could see all these other groups getting rights given to them, and they weren't given to us. And he said, we came to the conclusion, we might be mad, but we're not stupid. We want some of these rights as well. But I think that has morphed into something that it wasn't intended to be. And it's become that way of identifying yourself, emphasising your vulnerability, emphasising what's happened to you. And I don't think it does many people much help. You're identifying yourself with a trait, an identity. Well, one, the services aren't there anyway, even if you needed them, but many people don't need them.
Yeah. And don't the medical profession have to kind of take some responsibility for the fact that, as you say, putting those labels on people actually doesn't do those people very much good. But also, one of the things we've talked about from the economic perspective is the really big rise in personal independence payments and those kind of benefits. And it feels that, one of the ways in which people perhaps cope with things like, not being able to work is by really playing up to those characteristics. And I know that sounds very harsh, and you can't always just say to people, pull yourself together, but at the same time it feels that the medical profession is not helping people by giving them this rationale for not working.
Wasn't there something in the press 2 or 3 weeks ago where there was some GPs saying that they had never refused a prescription for people who'd come to them with mental health sort of issues?
They don't refuse a fit note. I think so effectively they'll sign them off work.
Yeah.
And I can understand that they were saying, because actually I can't judge what's in somebody else's head. Yeah. And I think we have to, as a country, just rethink this idea that it's GPs who are responsible to be gatekeepers of disability payments. That shouldn't be something GPs do. I think you need your relationship with your GP to be a very trusting one. And if you're thinking your GP is actually there to say yes or no to benefits, that's not the right relationship to have with your GP, is it?
Isn't it interesting you said fit note? It used to be called a sick note,
I know.
didn't it? It's an interesting change in terminology that they've brought in. So the idea you get fit back to work. It's tricky, that one, isn't it? Because it's the difference between how things are and how things should be. Sometimes I can understand if there's one person, everything's overwhelmed, they're overwhelmed by everything that's going on in their life, and they're feeling difficult to cope. Well, because of a lot of the political and social change, that's felt often in a very individualised way. You feel alienated from everything. There's a loss of those social connections. People weren't, going back, showing my age, but when people were going on strike in the 50s, 60s, 70s, they weren't running about singing Kumbaya, my lord. You know what I mean? They were deeply hurt. They were deeply angry. But the way that alienation from society was expressed was through some sort of solidarity, some action. And I think people are feeling it in a much more isolated way today. And encouraged by many, what we've termed, I've not termed it, other people have, therapeutic entrepreneurs, who are actually actively encouraging people to view those problems not as one of either, for you to take on individually, to try and cope with, or it could be due to social and economic issues, but to view them through the prism of mental health, of mental illness. And then people do believe that. When people go to I'm sure some don't, but when a lot of people go to their doctor and say they're stressed because of A, B, C, D, probably not lying. They actually do feel it. But the solution, certainly long term, is not a sick note or fit note, as they're called now, because actually work is seen as one of the most beneficial things for your mental health.
Yeah. One of the difficulties when talking about mental health is that if you had a physical problem, like, you've broken your knee or something, or you've broken your leg, I think it's a lot clearer to see how that's happened and to judge it against somebody else that's broken their leg.
Yes.
Right? It's a lot more visible. And the psychological might play a role. I mean, there's been interesting studies into how different people recover from physical illnesses, but it's a lot less of a factor. The thing with mental health is, whilst it is a physical problem in a sense, right? They've looked at people who are going through certain mental health issues. Their brains are different to people's brains who are fit and well. There's a much bigger factor in terms of consciousness and our environmental, our social, the environmental and social factors that play a role in mental health problems. And too often our highly individualized society only looks at the medical side of it. And so if you've got a person that's suffering, and this is different as well for different mental health issues, but if you've got, schizophrenia is very different to depression, for example. And if you've got somebody that's suffering from depression, there's a highly, highly, highly likely probability that one of those environmental social factors is playing a role, like isolation or stress or any of these. And so if the response is immediately, oh, we'll fix that with a medical solution, you know, we'll sign you off work, we'll give you pills, it's not really fully dealing with the situation. And I found it interesting what you said about the I suppose the death of like collectivism and into individualism, because one of the factors one of the symptoms of being when you have depression is that you have an inability to envisage the future, and you think that nobody else is going through what you're going through, right? And this is a really interesting one because I've spoken to a lot of people that are suffering from mental health problems, and it's always the same. It's like nobody else would imagine what I'm going through. Now, obviously, we all recognise the fact that we're all human beings. We all go through very similar things, maybe to different degrees. But that era, or this era of completely focusing on the individual, just amplifies that issue of saying, well, it's me, it's a personal problem.
Yes.
And it's not something that can be dealt with in a social setting.
Yes. But there's also, I suppose one of the reasons I sort of find the whole thing of mental health intriguing is the complexity of it, which sometimes it's fascinating, other times it's very frustrating. There is also, I think, a trend today to absolve ourselves of individual responsibility by blaming your diagnosis. You see that in, if we can think of, or I suppose we've blurred boundaries so much, we're frightened to make moral judgments. And one of my favourite examples of this was, have you heard of an organisation called Platform 51? Well, many years ago, they've changed their name again. I was reading a report in the newspaper. It sort of summarises quite a bit of what we've been talking about. And it was front page of one of the broadsheets, 60% of women mentally ill. Now, before I even started reading that, I says, it won't be mental illness, they'll use mental health problems, because you make it more elastic, more people can fit into it. And sure enough, that's what they did. And then I got the report. What I found more interesting was what they characterised as symptoms of female mental illness. And it was sexual promiscuity and alcohol and drug misuse. There was loads of symptoms, but they were the ones that caught my eye. So I looked into it in more depth. And you have actually heard of Platform 51, because before they changed their name to Platform 51, they were known as the Young Women's Christian Association. Now, they're still concerned with the same things. They've always been had a downer on female sexuality and inebriation, but as those old moral religious arguments, that moral religious discourse, as that no longer had so much hold in society, they changed with their times, still had the same concerns, but were now reframing them as mental health issues. Yeah, and I was asked, I think it was actually by Michael Portillo, what I thought of that. And I said, to be honest, I said, if it's a toss-up between the therapeutic discourse of Platform 51 and the religious moral discourse of the YWCA, I'm with the YWCA, because at least they gave the women moral autonomy to do what they want, sleep with who they wanted, drink and take drugs if they wanted. They disapproved of it. They seen it as immoral, but they granted them moral autonomy to make that decision. Dressed up in the therapeutic discourse of Platform 51, women don't even get given that. Their behaviour isn't their choice, it's due to an underlying mental disorder. I thought that was a very interesting summary of some of the key changes in society.
And has that organisation changed the way it handles things then?
They changed. I don't know what they're called now.
Changed the name again.
They've changed their name again.
Okay.
Yeah. Probably into some neurodiversity sort of name.
Just explain to me what you mean by that. So you were saying that the YWCA, whilst they disapprove of people's actions, they would at least say it's up to you to make those decisions.
Yeah, you've got moral autonomy to make those decisions. The wrong decisions in their view, but it's your decision. Platform 51, you may think it's your decision, but it isn't. It's because you've got an underlying psychological problem.
Oh, I see. Okay. Interesting. Okay.
And you see that sort of quite a bit. I mean, and it is that blurring of boundaries, isn't it? We see all the time. And it's because there is no clear-cut boundary. It is a tricky one. When does a naughty child become the child with ADHD? Yeah. Those, and just a plug for a book that I've written a foreword for, a chap called Dave Clements. I think it's due to be published this month, called Crisis in the Classroom. I just forget the subtitle, but it's looking at autism, ADHD, and neurodiversity. I had a look at some of the draft work and I've done a foreword for the book. And that's very, very good at looking at the issues we've been speaking about, but specifically around children, autism and ADHD. Highly recommended.
Great. What we try to do, if we can at all, Ken, is to try to bring something positive to the discussion by maybe trying to tease out from you, if you're kind of king for the day, what would you do in the mental health field that you think would really help and address some of those issues that you've been raising, some of those problems that you've been outlining?
Well, I think we need some more social cohesion. I think that would help, more social connections in terms of the broader trend. If we're looking at the more severe end, what I often found was what would be very beneficial is more, like you get retirement homes for older people where you've got your own place, but there's communal areas and there's staff there as well. I've always thought there's a lack of that. So you went from, so you're in hospital. If you were really bad, a nursing home. If you were pretty bad, but not nursing home, a sort of residential home, couple of halfway houses, and then your own place. Isolated again, maybe just seeing a couple of workers once a week. I think there's a need for that, where people can have their own space, but support as and when required for people that are on that sort of medium to high level. For the vast majority, I think we need to stop seeing all our problems through the prism of mental health. I think because we've got rid of the literal straitjacket, but there's a real danger that we've swapped it for its metaphorical equivalent. We're trapped within that prism of mental health. Lowered expectations, can't cope with everyday life. And if we're interested, obviously you are both politicians, if you're interested in changing society, you've got to be able to change yourself as well.
Great. Well, social cohesion is something we talked about quite a bit, isn't it, on the podcast, how we rebuild that. And I guess it has some impact on the things that we're thinking about in terms of local elections and council elections. What are the kind of things that councils could be doing to improve that social cohesion?
Yeah, and I really like what you said about the we need something else for people to be able to live together, and particularly intergenerationally as well. This is something that it just seems to not happen anymore, where people don't mix with people of different ages. There was I don't know if you ever caught that. Was it a Channel 4 thing where they took students from I was going to say a kindergarten. That's very American, isn't it? A
nursery.
Nursery, is that what we call it? and into a care home. And they said this is a genius solution, right? Because the elderly people had some, these tiny kids to play with, and the little kids loved it. And I just thought, yeah, obviously, right? It's like how have we got so far away from that? But yeah, I've been to Denmark to visit these bofallerskabs, which are like it translates as like quite literally as co-living, I think, but they are sort of intergenerational communities where they'll have a shared house in the middle that they cook in and eat in all together, and they've got their own private homes around it. It's amazing. So something like that. We need some bofallerskabs. That's what I'd have on my policy for the UK.
Okay.
Sounds good.
And I know our fellow SDP member Ron is very keen on that kind of communal living as a solution to adults' social care. So great. So thank you, Ken. Okay. Culture Club, yes. So not done Culture Club for a while, have we? Ken, have you got something for Culture Club?
I've got a film and a book.
Oh, superb.
A what, sorry?
A film and a book, he said.
In Scotland...
Accent, I was like, a what book?
in Scotland, we pronounce... I can't even say it in English. Film, F-I-L-L-U-M. Film, yeah. Well, I think the film it has got to be, because it's high profile, I Swear, about the kid with Tourette's syndrome. So it's very apt to this discussion. It's also, you'll be in tears of laughter at parts of it, and you'll have a tear in your eye at some of the sadder aspects of it, showing the reality of living with Tourette's. The book... Tiffany Jenkins, Intimates and Strangers, about the erosion of private life. I read that not long after it came out, and I thought it's one of the best books I've read in several years.
I watched her give a talk last summer about the book.
Yeah.
I thought it was a really, really interesting discussion, because it's not something I've really thought of before.
Yeah.
And there was a great discourse between the audience and her about the separation between private and public life, and something that you just I don't necessarily think of those as two separate things, but really interesting.
Yeah, I thought
the film, absolutely loved it. One of the best films I've seen in a long time. And I actually cried in the cinema watching it. Yeah. There's one little bit where it just really got me and it reminded me of a scene in another British film, I, Daniel Blake. Have you seen that?
Yes.
And I think I could pick out, probably count on one hand the scenes that have really made me choke up in a film. And it's incredibly powerful. There's one particular scene which, if anyone's watched it, it's when the female character is washing up, right? And there's a particular moment where I just think it's so powerful. Did you see the controversy about the BAFTAs?
Yes,
did you hear about this?
No.
So, gosh. So the film itself is about a guy called John Davidson, who I'm watching the film thinking to myself, because he's getting bullied a lot as a kid, and the adults don't understand why he's swearing. And I'm thinking, like, does nobody know about Tourette's? Yeah. Right? And then I realise, as you watch the film, I know about Tourette's because of this guy, right?
Yeah.
And he actually attended the BAFTAs as a guest, and you can hear him shout out a couple of times and have these tics. And there was the two actors from the film Sinners, Delroy Lindo and Michael B. Jordan, two black actors, Americans, were on stage, and he shouted out the N-word. And it was, really quite a shocking moment. But what was interesting, I suppose, is that there was a lot of dialogue afterwards, particularly online. And a lot of people just completely, I think, misunderstood the fact that this is, this is an illness, right? He's not purposefully shouting it out. And the whole point of Tourette's is you say the thing that you are least wanting to say, right? That you're trying to suppress. And so they were saying this is, internalized racism and whatever. But I thought that was a very interesting.
Yeah. And what struck me as well was, obviously it was very unfortunate, but it shouldn't have been that surprising. The film's about Tourette's. He's there in the audience. He's been invited. He's got Tourette's. Maybe they could have managed it better. I don't know. I think there were some. I've seen some of the stuff on it's not called Twitter now, on X and social media that you're referring to, Sebastian, I think some of the mainstream media, they were also concerned that it wasn't cut out. So there's a 2-hour delay between them filming it and it going out to the TV audience. There was an issue about that. But the fact that it happened should be no surprise, like you say. And that chap, I don't know if you remember at the end, it shows you him as a young kid in the documentary they made.
Yeah.
Years ago. I remember watching it. And
What's the documentary called?
Oh, I can't remember now.
Just slipped my mind. Something John, isn't it? John, 3 words.
Yes,
we'll have to link to it in the description.
And but it made me laugh when he was a young teenager, and I said, "What was your family like? What your brothers and sisters?" How'd they go? He says, "They're annoying." He says, "Why?" He says, "When it's ever their birthday, they'll say to me, 'What's Mum and Dad got me for my birthday? What have they got me?'" And he's like, Go on, what they got me? And then he'll go, bike, fucking bike. You know, he had a right good sense of humour with it. But yeah, that's. I mean, I've worked and actually studied with some people with Tourette's, and it's one of those where I think the film sums it up. At times, it's funny, and it is funny. Sometimes it's gallows humour funny, and other times it's tragic about the reality of the pain that people going through.
I made this comment about a book that we were discussing in a conference last year about how I felt that the author wasn't with me in a scene where I felt that there was a lot of moral ambiguity and it wasn't recognised. And with I Swear, I feel like the director they've managed to create really funny moments, which you can laugh at. And it's like, this is okay, laugh at this. Now this is a sad moment. And it's right there with you the whole time. The morality of the film is on display. So I'd highly recommend it if you haven't seen it.
And Sebastian, you have a Culture Club item as well, don't you?
I do, just because I had my monthly book club on Saturday and we read Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness.
I read it last year.
Did you?
Yeah.
What did you make of it?
I loved it.
Okay, can you explain to me what happened? Because I have no idea. I found it so complicated and difficult to follow.
But wasn't the film Apocalypse Now was based on, because it's the same name, the main character in the book, and the main character in that film Apocalypse Now, although obviously it's different stories. You've put me on one now, I can't.
So essentially, the book, the story starts with them stuck on this boat on the Thames, and they're waiting for the tide to turn. And whilst they're waiting, one of the characters called Marlowe starts telling them about this story of when he went out to Africa to captain a freshwater vessel, like a steamboat. And he starts telling the story, but since then I've looked into it, and supposedly Conrad decided to tell it in a very confusing way to echo that idea that Marlowe himself has sort of suffered some trauma with what happened, so he's not even able to recount the story logically. So it jumps bits, and you think, oh, where is he now? And the boat's now working, okay. And it's very odd, but he goes to and it's the book isn't clear about where this is. And I was because I knew that Apocalypse Now was the film that they made after the book, I assumed it would be Vietnam and like French Indochina. But quite quickly you realise it's not. And I thought, it's got to be the Congo then. And it sure enough is supposed to be the Congo River. And so as he gets further and further up the Congo River, he gets more and more into the Heart of Darkness and the confusing and much more, let's say, barbaric way of life. And he is trying to get to this character called Kurtz, who has become part of the locals and has sort of he's taken up their customs, gone native.
Yes.
And I think the book, in some ways, it's a critique of, or a contrast between what you might consider the barbarity of the colonialists and the barbarity of the natives. And that's an interesting contrast. I found it it hard to get anything from because it's such a complicated narrative. It's not obvious what's happening at any one point. So I don't know if I would recommend it as much as the film I Swear. It's short. It's only 120 pages long.
Yeah, it's very short.
One thing that makes it even more complex is that it has a first-person narrative of a character you never know the name of, who's sat on the boat in the Thames. And when Marlowe goes to start telling his story, it's written in speech marks, single quotation marks. So he says, I went to the Congo. Then when Marlowe is telling, mentioning people, things that people have said, it uses double quotation marks. And at parts of the story, it comes out of that and it says, he lit his cigarette. I think this is Marlowe speaking. I'm like, no, they're back on the Thames. They're back on the Thames. Yeah, so it's complicated.
Well, it's really nice for you to bring something to Culture Club, Sebastian. So well done. Sounds very patronising, that, doesn't it? But as you say, perhaps not recommending it wholeheartedly to listeners.
He was writing in his third language, it must be said, Joseph Conrad, who I think originally was from Ukraine. And that in itself is a reason to read the book because the prose is spectacular, like absolutely spectacular. You read it and you're being washed over with this beautiful language.
If I can throw in an older one related to what we've been discussing, the book, not the film, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, because that was read as, if you've seen the film, Jack Nicholson goes into the psychiatric unit. And what's interesting when you read it is how it was seen as sort of a metaphor for, like, at the time, psychiatry, barbaric, imprisoning people. The anti-psychiatry movement was very popular at the time, but also for the moral, as a metaphor for the moral vacuity of post-war consumer society as well. So there's that narrative going through it as well. Pretty hidden, but it's there if you look for it.
Superb. Great. Well, lots of recommendations there.
Have you not got one?
We generally only bring one between us, to be honest, Ken. So we kind of store up a few so that we've got some the next time.
That's just an excuse. It's not done anything.
I was actually due to go to a gig on Saturday night and I forgot to go.
You forgot to go?
No, had so much work on. I just forgot to go. And everybody went, said it was great. So really upset that I forgot to go. Anyway, I think that's a good place to end on the lots of culture there. Thanks everybody for listening, and we will see you next time.
Thanks for listening. Thanks, Ken.
And thank you for having me. Enjoyed it.